Picture yourself standing at the edge of your field in the spring of 536, waiting for warmth that simply never comes. That frost, the one that should have melted weeks ago, is still there every morning. It's coating the rows you turned over with so much hope and effort. You look up, the way farmers do, dozens of times a day, searching for the sun. And there it is. But something is terribly wrong with it. The sun hangs pale and bluish behind a thin, dry haze. It's giving you light, but no heat. You can stare straight at it without any pain in your eyes. It casts almost no shadow beneath your feet. There's no cloud you can name, no storm gathering on the horizon. Just an endless, pale sky and a cold that won't break. Deep in your chest, something animal awakens, a dawning understanding that something has happened to the world that nobody living has ever witnessed before. This isn't about a single terrible day. This is about a year when the sun dimmed slowly and never came back. It's about the people who had to keep living under it anyway. Over the next 47 minutes, we're going to walk through a year that historians, people who have studied every disaster humanity has records of, have called, without hesitation, the worst year in human history to be alive. By the end, you'll never look at an ordinary, bright, shadow-casting sun the same way again. Let me explain why this claim isn't exaggeration, because it's a big thing to say. We usually measure past catastrophes by how many people they killed. We think of the Black Death, which took perhaps half of Europe. We think of wars, plagues, famines. But when scholars studying the distant past asked a different question, not which year killed the most people in one blow, but which single year started the most suffering, which year broke the most of the world at once, which year set in motion a decade of dying, they kept coming back to the same answer. Not any of the famous disasters. It was this one. 536. A year almost nobody remembers. A year in the shadowy centuries after Rome fell, when darkness came across half the planet's sky. Crops failed everywhere from Ireland to China. The cold didn't lift for years. It was the beginning of the worst period of time our species has any record of, and almost no one knows about it. Come back with me to that spring. Let's understand what you're actually seeing when you look up at that pale, damaged sun, spreading across all of Europe, across the Middle East, and far away across Asia. In 536, people looked up and wrote down in the few places where anyone was still writing anything that the sun had lost its strength. In the Mediterranean world, an official and scholar documented that the sun gave out light without brightness. It was like the moon, he said, for the entire year. Month after month after month, it looked like a sun in eclipse. Another writer, working for a king, described a summer with no heat in it. He talked about crops chilled by northern winds and a sky where the sun was a strange, dim, bluish thing. The moon, even when full, had lost its light. They wrote about frost in the middle of what should have been harvest time. Fruit that wouldn't ripen. A whole year that passed without any real summer at all. These weren't superstitious peasants making things up. These were the most educated people their world had to offer. They were afraid. They were describing, as clearly as they could, a sky that had simply stopped working. But you, standing in your field, don't have their words or their view of the world. You only have your own patch of sky and your own patch of earth, and both are betraying you. You have to understand what a farmer's entire life is built on, because that's what's being taken away now. Everything you know, everything your parents taught you and their parents taught them before that, it's all a calendar written in sunlight. You plant when the earth warms. You tend and weed through the long, strong days of summer, when the sun climbs high and beats down and pours its heat into the grain. The grain swells and ripens and turns golden and hard. You harvest in that last great warmth. You store it against the dark ahead. That wheel is what your whole existence turns on. It has never failed, not in all the memory of your people. Now the wheel has jammed. The sun climbs, but it doesn't burn. The days get longer, but they don't warm. The grain comes up thin and green and hesitant. Then it just stops growing. It stands in the cold fields, waiting for heat that never arrives. And you stand there with it, watching your own survival refuse to grow. We know now, from evidence those people could never have imagined, exactly what happened. And it's worth saying plainly, even though not one person in 536 could have known it. Somewhere far to the north, most likely in the ice and fire of Iceland, a volcano of tremendous power erupted. It threw an enormous curtain of ash and sulfur high into the air. So much of it, flung so high, that it didn't come back down in days or weeks. It spread. It drifted on the high winds until it wrapped around the entire northern half of the world. A thin, high, poisonous veil, far above the clouds, above the weather, in a place where no rain could ever wash it away. And that veil did one simple, devastating thing. It stood between the earth and the sun. It caught part of the sunlight that should have reached the ground and threw it back into space. So everything below became cooler, dimmer, colder. This is what a great eruption does. It doesn't just bury the land nearby. It can reach across the entire globe and steal the summer from people thousands of miles away. People who will never know which mountain did it. And people were living through the worst theft of summer in all of civilization, without any idea of what was happening. Now let's follow what that stolen summer actually does to you, day by day. Because famine doesn't arrive all at once, and understanding the order it comes in is the only way to truly feel how it was lived. In that first strange, cold year, you don't starve. You have stores. Every farming family keeps back grain from the previous harvest, saved in the barn and the pit and the loft for exactly this kind of difficult time. So through that first autumn and winter of darkness, you use those stores. You make do. Maybe you're thinner than usual. You're certainly worried. But you're alive. You tell yourself what people always do, that it was a bad year, a strange year, that the next one will set things right. You wait for the sun to remember itself. Here's the cruelty that sits at the heart of this and lifts it above an ordinary failed harvest into a true catastrophe. The next year, the sun doesn't set things right. The cold holds on. That veil is still there, thinning slowly, But the chill it has poured into the land and the sea doesn't just disappear. The growing seasons that follow are stunted and short and cold as well. So the second harvest fails, or nearly fails, on top of the first. Now you're reaching into stores that were never filled back up. The arithmetic of survival starts to turn against you in a way one bad year never could. This is when a farming family faces the most terrible decision it can make. The one every peasant dreads above all others, the eating of the seed. In your barn, there is grain. That grain is two different things at once. It's food that can keep your children alive through the coming months, and it's seed that must go back into the ground in spring if there's going to be any harvest at all next year. In a normal, hungry winter, you starve yourself. You tighten every belt. You guard that seed grain with your life because you know that eating it means trading a hungry spring for a fatal autumn. But when the cold won't lift, when the second failed harvest becomes a third, the day comes in many households when the children are crying and there's nothing else, and the seed gets eaten. In that moment, the family's future gets eaten with it. They've chosen to live this month at the price of having nothing to plant, so nothing to reap. Next year, they'll have no stores, no crop, no seed, no way back. This is how famine truly kills. Not in one dramatic blow, but in a slow closing off of choices. Each one reasonable, each one desperate, until a family has quietly traded away every path that led out of the darkness. Watch how a household comes apart under this pressure, because it doesn't fall apart evenly. When food runs low, the body fails in an order, and the order breaks your heart. The very young go first, the babies and small children whose little bodies have no reserves to burn, who need steady feeding just to live. The very old go next, the grandparents who quietly eat less and less so the young might have more. They fade through the winter and don't wake up on a cold morning. The strong adults last the longest, the ones who can still work, still look for food, still walk the frozen roads looking for anything to bring home. They hold on and hold on as their strength drains away until finally they too start to stumble. And alongside this comes a second enemy. A starving body can't defend itself. The illnesses that a healthy person shrugs off in a week become killers when there's no strength left to fight them. So in a great famine, it's often not hunger alone that makes the final mark, but fever or sickness sweeping through bodies too weak to resist, taking the young and the old and finally the strong, house by house along a lane as the smoke from cooking fires grows thinner every week. Let me show you what there is to eat in a household 2 winters into the darkness. Because the food of famine is its own slow horror, and it comes in a grim and orderly line. First, you stretch what real grain you have. You grind it coarser. You bake smaller loaves. You mix the flour with whatever will bulk it out. Then, when the grain itself is gone, you turn to things that aren't food in any normal year. You strip the soft inner bark from trees and dry it and grind it into bitter, woody flour. You bake the gray, heavy stuff that comes out of it and call it bread because you have to call it something. You dig for roots you'd never touch in a good year. You boil nettles and weeds and the green shoots of anything you're not sure is poisonous. You feed the thin broth to your children and drink what's left yourself. You kill the last chicken that was still giving you eggs, knowing as you do it that you're eating next spring along with tonight. You boil old leather harness and hides and even the shoes off your feet, looking for the last tiny bit of nourishment locked inside. You crack the bones for their marrow and then boil them again and again until they give up nothing at all. Every one of these steps is a door closing quietly behind you, a small giving up of the future to buy a few more days in the present, until at last there are no more doors left to close. A family that has eaten its seed and its animals and the bark from its own trees sits in a cold and silent house with nothing and waits. And here is something you must understand about who lived and who died, because it was not random. It tells you a great deal about the shape of that world. The people most exposed to the darkness were the grain farmers, those whose entire survival depended on a single kind of crop ripening during a single warm season, because that was exactly the thing the veil had destroyed. But not everyone lived that way. The herders, the people who kept cattle and sheep and goats, had more flexibility because animals could be walked to wherever pasture survived and could be eaten when everything else failed, converting the last of the grass into meat and milk and another month of existence. The fishermen along coastlines and great rivers had the seas and waters, which the darkness dimmed but did not drain. A boat and a net could still bring food when the fields yielded nothing. And the truly powerful, the kings and great lords with granaries and storehouses and the strength to seize what they needed, suffered least of all, at least initially, because they had the deepest reserves and the furthest reach. As in every disaster in this series, the catastrophe struck first and hardest on the poorest and most narrowly dependent, the small farmer with one field, one crop, and no backup. It climbed slowly upward toward those with more ways to feed themselves. Hunger, like summer sickness and winter cold, was never distributed fairly. As the hunger deepened, the world beyond your own threshold began to collapse. A great famine does not only empty bellies, it dissolves the connections between people. In good years, the roads carried trade and news and travelers. In these years, they filled instead with desperate families walking away from farms that could no longer sustain them, carrying whatever they could hold, heading toward anywhere that rumor promised food, and very often finding only crowds of other starving people who had heard the same rumors from the opposite direction. The stranger appearing at your door, who in normal times would receive bread and the place by the fire, because that is what decent people do, became instead a threat. One more mouth in a world that had too few meals for the ones already inside, and doors that had stood open for generations were barred and locked. Charity itself began to starve as monasteries and great houses that fed the poor in ordinary hard times were drained by numbers they were never designed to support. And wherever order weakened, the cruel filled the void, so that on top of the cold and hunger and creeping sickness came the oldest fear of all, fear of other desperate people. Families came to dread the sound of footsteps on the road nearly as much as they dreaded the empty grain store. Look beyond your own failing field for a moment, because one of the most extraordinary things about the year 536 is how far it reached. It was not a local misfortune, but a wound that circled the entire northern half of the world. Far to the east, in China, the official histories of that year recorded something that astonished scholars when they read it centuries later. They recorded that yellow dust rained down like snow, and that in the height of summer, in the 8th month, snow truly fell, and the harvests were destroyed, and the people starved in a land that lay a whole world away from the volcano and from your cold European field. In Ireland, the annals that monks kept, the year-by-year records of a small island at the far western edge of everything, noted a failure of bread, a scarcity of food in these very years around the Mediterranean. The writers spoke of the dim sun and the ruined seasons. Across Scandinavia, in the cold north, where summers were already brief and precious, the theft of a summer was so severe that whole regions seemed to have emptied. Farms were abandoned, settlements swallowed back by the forest, and the people who remained buried astonishing quantities of gold in the ground, hoards of precious metal offered, it appears, in desperate prayer to gods who had turned their faces away. The same darkness, the same cold, the same hunger fell all at once on peoples who did not know each other existed. Every one of them looked up at the same failing sun and felt the same fear. Now come back down with me into the darkness, because we have not yet reached the worst of it. The failing sun was only the beginning. The people of this age were about to be struck a second time, and then a third, in a way that would make 536 the opening line of the deadliest decade in the entire record of the ancient world. Here is the part of the story that turned a terrible year into an unbearable age. If the darkness had come once and lifted, and the sun had returned strong the following spring, then 536 would be remembered as a single dreadful famine year among many. But it did not lift cleanly. The cold that the veil poured into the land and oceans lingered, and the years that followed remained unnaturally chill, so that the recovery every farmer prayed for never fully came. And then, just as the world was beginning perhaps to steady itself, a few years later, around 540, there came a second great eruption. Another vast mountain somewhere on the earth flung its poison into the high sky. It slammed the veil back into place over a world that had not yet recovered from the first. We know this now with certainty because the evidence is frozen into the ice of Greenland and the far south. Layer upon layer of ancient snow holds the chemical fingerprints of these eruptions. In those layers, scientists have found not one great spike of volcanic sulfur in these years, but two. One at the start of the darkness, and another close behind it. Two hammer blows falling within a few years of each other on the same broken world. The people who had survived the first, who had eaten their seed grain and buried their old and their young, and somehow crawled through, now watched the sky dim again and felt the cold return. They understood that whatever had come for them was not finished. And then came the third blow, and it was the deadliest of all. In the year 541, into a world already starved, already weakened, already thinned by years of failed harvests, there came a plague. It rose first in the eastern Mediterranean and spread along the trade routes and the grain ships into the heart of the surviving Roman world, into its great capital. It was bubonic plague, the same terrible sickness that would return 8 centuries later as the Black Death. It swept through cities packed with people whose bodies were already worn down by years of hunger, and it killed on a scale that the writers who survived it could barely find words for. They described the dead piling up faster than they could be buried, the carts, the pits, the silence that fell over streets that had roared with life. It may have killed tens of millions of people across the world, a huge portion of everyone then alive in the lands it reached. It is difficult not to see the connection, the grim logic of it. A population first starved by the darkness and cold, its defenses stripped away by years of hunger, and then a plague loosed upon exactly those weakened bodies. The failing sun did not kill by itself. It opened the door, and famine walked through. And then pestilence walked through behind the famine. And between the three of them, they emptied a great part of the world. You must understand what that plague was like to witness, because its speed and its cruelty were beyond anything those people had a framework to comprehend. A man could rise in the morning in what seemed like health and be dead before the sun had set. It announced itself with fever and a deep, dragging weariness. Then came the swellings, the hard and agonizing lumps that rose in the groin and armpit and neck. In many, the skin darkened as if bruised from somewhere deep within. Some fell into raving. Some sank into a heavy sleep and never woke from it. It came not to one house, but to all of them at once, so that a living, roaring city could pass in a matter of weeks into a place of horror. The market silent, the workshop still, the dead lying where they had fallen because there were no longer enough living people with the strength to carry the bodies away. Those who lived through it in the great eastern capital wrote of the burial pits filled and then overflowing, of corpses stacked in layers, of the ordinary rites of death abandoned entirely because death had come too fast and in too vast a number for any ritual to keep its pace. All of this fell upon a people already hollowed out by years of hunger, so that the plague found half its work already done and set about finishing the rest. How did the people living through this understand what was happening when they had no volcano to blame, no ice to read, no idea at all that a mountain on the far side of the world had reached up and dimmed their sky? They understood it the only way they could. They understood it as the anger of heaven, or as the ending of the world itself. For a people who saw the hand of God in every harvest and every storm, a sun that failed, a summer that turned to frost, a darkness that would not lift, could mean only one thing. They had done something so terrible that the very heavens were being taken from them in punishment. And so, across the darkened world, people did what frightened people have always done. They prayed harder than they had ever prayed. They gave what little they had to shrines and temples and churches. They walked in long processions under the dim sun, begging for its return. In the pagan north, they poured their gold into the earth, giving up their most precious treasure to gods who seemed to have turned their faces away. Everywhere, the sense grew that the end was near, that the world was in its final age. It is no accident that this is precisely the kind of century in which prophecies of the end of all things take deep root and spread. When you have watched the song itself grow sick, the idea that the world is dying does not feel like madness. It feels like the plain evidence of your own eyes. A haunting thread runs from this darkness all the way into the stories that people told long afterward, and it is worth pausing on because it shows how deep a wound this left in the memory of the world. In the far reaches of Scandinavia, among ancient northern peoples, there persisted through the ages a tale of an extraordinary winter, an unnaturally prolonged cold that was said to precede the world's ending. This would be a winter lasting several years without a warm season between, when the sun itself would vanish and frost would bind the earth, forcing humanity to turn against itself in desperation. This inevitable darkness was called the Twilight of the Gods in their oldest stories. Scholars today recognize that within this legend, transmitted and retold across centuries, lies an authentic recollection, a memory of actual years when summers ceased to return, when the sun was obscured by a veil of haze, and when northern lands came dangerously close to becoming empty wastelands. The devastation was so immense that it didn't merely end the lives of those who experienced it directly. Its impact rippled forward across time itself, shaping the fears and stories of all who inherited the world it remade. An event when daylight vanished, etched into memory and passed down as a prophecy of apocalypse. Let me explain how this mystery was finally solved, for it stands as one of history's greatest investigative triumphs and reveals the process by which buried truths eventually surface into daylight. For over 1,000 years, The year 536 lay hidden and nearly forgotten. There existed odd fragments scattered through ancient writings, references to a darkened sun, to summers without warmth, to yellow dust resembling snow. Yet these scattered lines remained in old parchments, disconnected from one another, easy to dismiss as exaggeration or mere legend. No one could bring them together into a coherent account. Then came modern science, disciplines capable of reading the record that Earth itself has written into its own substance. The first significant evidence emerged from the wood of ancient trees. Each year, a tree develops a new ring. Wide rings mark years of warmth and plenty. Narrow, cramped rings indicate years of brutal cold. When researchers collected wood samples from across the northern hemisphere and compared the rings, pattern against pattern, reading them like a coded record of centuries, they discovered something startling. Around the year 536, the rings nearly ceased to exist. Across Europe, across Asia, throughout that decade, trees produced almost nothing. Growth so meager and stunted, it had no parallel in thousands of years. The fingerprint of a world plunged suddenly into severe, unrelenting cold. The trees had preserved the memory of darkness that people's minds had lost. Then the ice revealed the rest of the story. Within the great ice sheets of Greenland and Antarctica, snow from each winter is locked in layers, compressed into ice over millennia, preserving within it the very air and dust of the season when it fell. Scientists drilling through those ice layers move backward through time, 1 year at a time, reading in each layer's chemistry, what conditions existed when that snow descended. When researchers reached the ice layers from those years, they found unmistakable evidence of tremendous volcanic events. Sharp elevations in sulfur content, the material that volcanoes eject into the upper atmosphere. One spike at 536, and a second spike years afterward, perfectly matching the two periods of dimness recorded in both the tree rings and the old written accounts. The picture finally became coherent. The pale sun that ancient chroniclers described, the crop failures stretching from Ireland to China, the shrunken tree rings, the sulfur trapped in ice, all pointed to an identical explanation. A veil of volcanic dust blocking the sky. A researcher examining this very evidence made a striking pronouncement. Comparing this year to every other year in the entire historical record, 536 marked the commencement of the most dreadful period anyone had ever lived through. Those who suffered through it didn't know what to call it or understand what caused it. It took 1,500 years, combined with the science of reading trees and ice, before anyone could finally comprehend what had truly taken place in the year when the sun departed. When you view the full arc of events, here's what that year and the following decade actually comprised. Not a single catastrophe, but a series of them, each triggering the one that followed. A mountain in the extreme north fractured and released a veil across the heavens. This veil obscured the sun's rays, and the diminished sunlight froze the world. The freezing ruined the crops. The failed crops created starvation. Hunger consumed the seeds and weakened the bodies of millions. Upon those weakened bodies descended a disease that destroyed people on a scale unprecedented in recorded history and unmatched for 8 centuries to come. It remapped the world. Following this period, previously failing societies completely unraveled. Entire areas became nearly empty. Populations moved, searching for regions capable of sustaining them. The depleted, disease-ravaged civilization that emerged afterward looked fundamentally altered compared to the world that had observed the sun's dimming in the spring of 536. Historians recognize this decade as a defining turning point, the moment when the slow fade of antiquity finally transitioned into the era we know as the medieval period. But those living through it, enduring each season's hardship, comprehended almost nothing of this grand historical narrative. They only perceived that the sun had failed them, that hunger consumed their lives, that terror gripped their hearts, and that they had to rise each freezing dawn beneath that damaged sky and find some way to live one more day. Consider those who survived, for persisting through such times represents its own profound, crushing weight. When the gloom eventually lifted permanently and the sun regained its former intensity, and when disease finally exhausted itself, the survivors emerged into a world that held far fewer human lives than the one of their birth. Fields lay abandoned, with nobody remaining to work them. Towns and villages had gone silent. Houses stood empty, their doors moving in winds now undisturbed. The forest was already gradually reclaiming territory worked by human hands for ages. For those who had kept their land and stayed alive, opportunity eventually came. In a world where people had become scarce and land abundant, those able to work grew infinitely valuable. Survivors of such devastation often discovered that the rigid social structures their ancestors knew began loosening, allowing possibilities their grandparents could never have imagined. But this perspective emerges only from the distance of centuries. In that moment, for one individual standing in the stillness of spring following all that death, there was mainly absence, empty spaces at tables, the silence of loss, and a memory that would endure a lifetime. The year the sky withdrew its light, a thing too profound to voice and impossible to fully record. Which brings me finally to your own sky, and to a privilege so tremendous and constant that you've never once recognized its value. Each morning the sun rises and it blazes down. It climbs overhead and radiates its warmth, casting shadows sharp and dark at your feet. It will continue this exact performance tomorrow and the day after that, and every single day you exist. You won't give it a thought. You might even complain it's too scorching, perhaps blocking it with a shade. The concept that the sun could grow weak and obscure, that a summer might simply not arrive, that the seasons your entire existence depends on could halt and leave you in a chilled field watching your crops fail to develop. This is not a fear you've ever held. Not once. Yet there was a year when this was not merely fear, but literal reality. For months upon months, half the world's population lived beneath a sun that had extinguished and didn't understand why or whether it would ever return. Each ordinary, bright summer day you've known is something the people of 536 would have wailed to witness. You received countless such days throughout your existence without ever learning what an astonishing gift they represent. And remember the next time you feel the plain and ordinary heat of the sun on your face, that there were once people who looked up at that same sun and watched it disappear.